riding, and that sort of thing. I do my riding mostly in the winter, although I'm very keen and anxious to get volume 2 of Cuba out. So I'm actually home this summer to finish that up and get that written. The welding part, that came in when my parents were building their yacht, which is a steel schooner, and they needed a welder. So I took night classes in St. Augustine, Florida, learned how to weld, and then during the day I would work on the boat. And by the end of that winter, working down there, it was built outside in Florida, I'd had so many hours in that I was able to get my certification, which was good because that way the boat is being welded by a certified welder. The other guides I write are for my area up here in the Canadian Maritimes. I'm in Nova Scotia right now at home.
Yeah. Wonderful. That's really amazing. I mean, for you to have taken welding classes, just to be able to help on the boat, that is really amazing. Kudos. And I see that a bunch of people have just joined us, so I just want to give a very short intro again quickly. That I am Jessica Anderson with Navionics, and I am a sailing and diving specialist. You have joined the preparation for Cruising Cuba webinar, and we are joined by Cheryl Barr, who is an author and an accomplished sailor and welder and marine biologist. So we're going to go on into some of the things that we're going to talk about in this webinar. We're going to talk about regulations and permitting. We're going to talk about anchoring, provisioning, and essentials. We're going to talk about winds, currents, sailing conditions, as well as exploring and experiencing Cuba. And again, for those of you that have just joined us, you can use the Q&A link in your control panel to send us questions, and we'll answer whatever questions we can inside the webinar. And if we don't get to your question, then we will email you an answer. And the Q&A will just type a question to us. I'll have everyone muted for the webinar because there is a lot of feedback if I unmute people. So to go ahead and start learning about how we can prepare to sail for Cuba. One of the first things that we were wondering about, Cheryl, is regulations and permitting. Where can I go? Where can I, how do I qualify to go to Cuba, and what kind of permitting do I need? And I do have a link here for those people that would like to get information after the fact.
Right.
But what kind of qualifications and permitting am I looking for?
I see that your link is for the Coast Guard 3300 form. Pretty much these days, because it's opened up enough pretty loosely, that that's almost all that you need. And the 12 OFAC categories, pretty well everyone can qualify under the one called people to people. So, and that's again very loose. Also, you don't have to apply anywhere to get those OFAC qualifications. It's a case of keeping a journal while you're in Cuba and retaining that for up to 5 years in case anybody ever came back and said, okay, well, what category were you under? And let's see your diary. So, I mean, and you can even fill out your diary once you get home. I heard that mentioned. So those are what you need from the US side. When you get into Cuba, you have to have your ownership papers of the vessel, whether it's a documented vessel or registered, and everyone on board needs a current valid passport. So pretty much that's it for paperwork as far as going to Cuba.
Okay, wonderful. That is definitely, I think that's one of the biggest questions that I've heard in the community, that there's so much confusion around what we can and can't do. And I mean, can we ever even see Cuba? So I think that answers a lot of questions. I did have a couple questions come in over Q&A. So one of them was, are you going to get, is there going to be a downloadable version of the slides? And yes, I will have Navionics post the downloadable version of the slides on their Facebook page. so that people that are interested in having the slides can get access to those. The other question we will answer a little bit later in the webinar. It's about having sat phones and GPS enabled devices both on the boat and taking them aboard. So we are going to address that a little bit later, just so you know it's coming. So we are going to move on to quarantine flags, which everyone that has cruised at all is familiar with, because that is always there and always on your mind thing. When am I going to put up my quarantine flag? When do I get to take it down? Cruising permits, check-in processes, and weapons restrictions, cruising with dogs, and restrictions on bringing products in and out of Cuba. So, Cheryl, can you tell us when and how we need to use the quarantine flag?
Okay, your quarantine flag, of course, is your yellow flag, and you would put that up generally once you're, say, 3 miles off, or you're just about getting into your port of entry, and the flag will remain hoisted from the spreaders until you've actually cleared in. And Cubans are very official, so they will actually tell you, okay, now you can take your flag down and put the Cuban flag up. Your cruising permit, when you get to Cuba, all the permitting, you don't need to have any permits for Cuba before you go. I know some places tell people they need their tourist visas, they need everything ahead of time. That's not true. Once you get there, you'll get your tourist visa, your cruising permit, which is actually an entry, exit, and cruising permit all in one. It's at only $55. Now the permit is not actually given to you until you leave the port of entry to go off cruising. So you need to tell them, okay, I'm ready to go, I'm going cruising, and then you will have the permit and you get the stamps for it, and then you're set to go. The check-in, at the actual check-in, it's gotten a lot easier over the years. It used to take hours and hours, but it has been shortened now. Some days it's a bit slower than others, depending on how speedy the Garda are, or if it's a hot day, or how many boats are ahead of you. But generally you can figure on 1.5 to 2 hours, depending on if you have weapons on board. That will definitely slow things down a great deal. And I would say, as far as going to Cuba, it's basically it's kind of like a military dictatorship. You don't need any weapons because nobody has any military arms except for maybe the government. I've never seen a Guardia Frontera, well, maybe once, with a gun. Generally, people aren't armed in Cuba. So having weapons, they're not needed, and they will be a hindrance for traveling. The costs of the check-in, there was a very large increase in the tourist visa. It used to be $25, and for Americans and Europeans, the $25 tourist visa was good for 30 days, renewable for 30 days at another $25. I'm calling it dollars, but it's actually Cuban convertible pesos. They increased that to $75, which is quite outrageous. And again, that's just your 1 month. Presumably then for your extension, you pay another $75. So that was a huge increase. And that's for everybody on the boat, your tourist visa. The $55 is for the boat entry, your entry, exit, and the cruising permit. Pretty much that's it as far as your costs go for entering. A lot of people travel with pets. When we go to Cuba, we often take a cat with us. But you can bring pets into Cuba. Someone asked about microchipping your dogs. We have friends that we travel with who have their dog, and microchipping has not been an issue. Probably Cubans don't have the technology to do the microchipping, I'm sure. As long as the pets, whether it's dogs or cats, have their recent health certificate, their rabies shots, then you're fine. Products bringing in and out of Cuba. There is an official list, which is quite long, but it's not enforced except perhaps for citrus, eggs, and some of the meat, such as the poultry. But often if the frozen foods are fine, eggs, if they're boiled, but recently the people who come on board and check all of this, they've been pretty good about it. We used to hide a few eggs or bury stuff deep in the freezer, but the check that they do has become quite cursory. They don't check too much.
Well, we do have a few questions coming in here. Is the $75 visa per person or for the whole crew?
No, that's each person. So that's really bumped up the cost for the cruising boaters. I know for fly-in tourists, it's still at the $25. So this is just nailing the cruisers, getting what they can out of them. So that's each person. The $55 cost for the boat is just for the boat and the permits.
Thanks for that question, Bob and Gordon. You both asked that question. Good questions. I would like to do a shout out to Lee. I know that Lee went into Blue Water today and purchased all of the important things for cruising Cuba. And I know he's having a dinner party tonight watching our webinar. And one of the things he was wondering about is the visa. Can you get it at the port of entry?
Yeah, that's exactly where you get it from. Once you've gone through the check-in process and part of that is the Guardia Frontera and Customs and Immigration. So that's who issues you your visa. I know a lot of people think they need to get it ahead of time, apply for it while they're in the States. You probably can, but it's not necessary, and that's probably complicated. I've also been told, and when you arrive in Cuba, you don't need a paper like an exit permit from the country that you've just come from. I've been hearing people coming from the Bahamas, and the Bahamas are telling people there that they need to buy, I think it's for $65, an exit permit from the Bahamas because it's needed when you check into Cuba. Well, that's not true. So that sounds like just a bit of a money grab from the Bahamas, trying to get a little extra cash.
Yeah, it's all about the money, right? Yeah. Okay, thanks for those answers. That's great. Can you tell us, while we're on this slide, can you tell us where this picture was taken and a little bit about it?
Okay, that photo was taken at the end of March of this year. I was sailing aboard White Hawk. That's the it's a 105-foot classic wooden ketch out of Newport, Rhode Island. And the photo is taken at Marina Gaviota on the north coast, but I joined the boat while it was on the south coast, and we did some extensive cruising down there, and then did a 50-hour transit around to Marina Hemingway from Cienfuegos, and then we worked our way along the north coast a little bit. So that was actually, I left the boat there, I was getting off, and they were then headed back to Florida.
Wonderful. It looks beautiful.
Oh, it was a fantastic boat.
So where would we anchor while we're in Cuba? And when we're sailing around Cuba, where would we anchor while we're around Cuba? Where can we go ashore? And I know that there were 3 specific anchorages, and I did mark these. They're a little hard to see, but you can see the red line around these anchorages. So,
okay.
Can you tell us a little about all of those?
Yeah, wow. Okay, so there are lots of anchorages. Cuba has some wonderful, what's called a pocket bay, and within one bay can be almost a cruising destination in itself. So lots of anchorages there. Lots of keys and islands where you can anchor. You've put Cienfuegos, Santiago, and Puerto Vita there. Those are check-in ports and marinas there. So Cuba's very limited in the number of marinas. Open operating marinas, there's 8. I think it's 8. Might even be down to 7 now. Some of their marinas we would not call a marina, but they do. So really, you are anchoring most of the time. Where you can go ashore, well, certainly at any of the marinas, which are, as I said, the port of entries, you can go ashore there without any problems. You will have cleared in with the Guardia Frontera. They will have looked at your cruising permit, signed it, initialed it. As far as anchorage, you can, I know there's a lot of word out there that people say, oh, you cannot anchor anywhere in Cuba. That's not true. You can anchor anywhere in Cuba. Now, occasionally, if there's a Guardia Frontera post there, they may want you to move from where you've dropped anchor to right in front of them so they can watch you. But the Guardia Frontera are not everywhere. There are so many places around the coast that there's just nobody. A lot of mangroves in Cuba, so you can be in a huge bay, mostly mangroves with some beaches, so you can drop anchor where you want and then dinghy over to the beach and go for a swim. The issue comes in towns and villages. So that's where if you pull into a little port, there's a little town there, there will be a Guardia Frontera. They are easing up a little bit. For the most part, right now, they're not letting you go ashore, but it's also at the whim of the guard on duty that day. If he's a nice guy, easygoing, you can probably talk him into letting you go ashore. Sometimes they'll say, oh, but one person needs to stay on the boat while the others go ashore. You know, it's quite random. So I would say anytime you pull into a spot where there's a town or village, always, I mean, you want to go ashore. That's the whole point of being there. Always ask, right? Just say you want to go to shore. Sometimes have a little plan, have a jerry jug and say, well, you know, we've run out of fuel for the outboard, or, you know, or we don't have any vegetables, or some reason why you have to go ashore. And if the guard is a reasonably nice guy, he's going to let you go ashore. But as I said, Cuba, there's not a lot of towns and villages on the coast. Cuba was developed more as an agricultural island. So most of what you actually want to see town-wise, architecture, the culture, it's a little more inland from the coast. So when you're cruising around Cuba, you're not going to see a lot of Cubans because you're not going to be near too many towns. You will see lots of fishermen, though, lots of Cuban fishermen in their little boats.
That's interesting. You see very much the same thing in the out islands of the Bahamas. I think you see a lot of the fishermen in their little boats, but not as many just people on the coast because a lot of the out islands are not established. So I personally have not been to Cuba, though I am very much looking forward to going there after this webinar. So that's really interesting that it's kind of the same thing as the out islands of the Bahamas. We have a few questions coming in. Peter wants to know if a powerboat into Havana is an issue.
Well, not unless it's over 200 feet, right? There's powerboats can get in no problem, but in Marina Hemingway, as you're coming in the entrance, there's a 90-degree turn. So about 150 foot, 160 foot is max that can get in there.
Okay, great. And John was wondering, he sent us a sequence of how he experienced the check-in about 5 years ago, or a few years ago. He says the sequence of his check-in was he experienced his 5 experiences years ago was to email Hemingway and ETA, and they would inform officials. Entry entailed stopping at Guardia Frontera dock first at Hemingway. Then they directed him to the berthing, and you waited for customs and immigration and sanitation officer. Is that the same now?
as I said earlier, they have lightened up a lot. It isn't necessary to contact them ahead of time. When we first started going to Cuba and checking in, which was certainly more than 5 years ago, it was, I think, 97, 6 or 7, we had 22 people come on the boat, all officials in some capacity, and it just took hours, like 4 and 5 hours. We just showed up. We've never applied for any permitting. We've never let any marinas know ahead of time that we were coming. So that's not necessary. You go through the Guardia Frontera, Customs and Immigration. There will be the Health Department of Health and Agriculture. They'll send some people. Usually one of them may be a veterinarian. If you've got a pet, there'll be a vet that comes down. And sometimes maybe we paid $5 for bringing the cat in. So there might be a little fee for bringing in a pet.
Wow. I know in the Caribbean, there are a lot of different countries in the Caribbean, of course, because a lot of the different islands are different countries. We had a dog with us when we were cruising, and it was far, far more than $5, $10, $15, $20, or $50.
Oh, wow.
That is quite the deal. We do have another question from Jim. He's asking about what about U.S. Coast Guard permission to enter the Cuban territorial waters? Do you need U.S. Coast Guard permission?
Well, that's your Form 3300. I think it's called CG, as in Coast Guard 3300. So that would be the permission from them.
Okay. And we have another question about diving and fishing restrictions. Mm-hmm. If you can buy a lobster, conch, or fishing license, or is that included like it is in the Bahamas?
No, it's not included in anything you buy, and in fact, they have no permitting. Technically, it's illegal for you to do any fishing or lobstering or conching in Cuba. The only permit you can get is if you're an official entrant in a sport fishing tournament, or if you're in Cuba on a guided fishing trip, then there is permitting. If you're in Cuba on your own boat cruising around, they figure that you will, and which you will, fish enough, maybe lobster or fish or conch for use, personal use for that day. So that is technically illegal, but it is overlooked.
Okay.
So, yeah, and they have a huge lobster fishery. So getting lobster is highly illegal. But as I say, for a cruising boat to get a few lobster now and then, it's not a big deal. You'll meet lots of fishermen who are fishing lobster. All of that lobster belongs to the government. They're working for the government. Now, because you're in such remote places, they'll often sell you some, because they'll just pocket that money and get a little extra. Shrimping as well. There's a commercial shrimp fishery. But yeah, technically fishing is illegal in Cuba, and there's no licensing. You can't get a license.
Yeah, so that kind of touches on the other question about, can we just buy fish, shrimp, or lobster, or conch from the local fishermen?
Well, yeah, Cubans, they don't eat a lot of conch, so that's not something you generally see the fishermen with. Back in March, when I was on the North Coast, we met a couple little fishermen in a small boat, and we didn't give them any cash. We brought them a few trinkets that we had on the boat. They didn't expect anything, but we brought some t-shirts and a few things. They gave us some octopus, which I hadn't eaten before. So we had some octopus and some, I think there was some lobster and one huge snapper. So that was great. So you can buy it sometimes or trade, or sometimes they're just happy. It's all they have, and they're happy to give something to you. Cubans are very generous in that way. Yeah.
That sounds like a pretty good deal. A few trinkets and things for a nice snapper and some octopus. And we had an octopus arepa in Puerto Rico, and it was really delicious. But I have never tried making that from octopus that I've either caught or bought
Yeah.
from a fisherman.
One thing I should say, because I know a lot of people go to the Bahamas and they get their fishing license and they fish, a lot of them, for the lobster and then load their freezers up with that. I definitely don't recommend that you do that in Cuba, because there is a checkout process, right? So you check into the country, they look through the boat. When you leave the country, they look through the boat, and if they opened your freezer and found it full of lobster, you would be in so much trouble.
That is very good to know, because I do know a lot of people as well that do the same thing, kind of have the same expectations. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, yeah.
We have a few more questions coming in here. What about embarking or disembarking guests while in Cuba? Is that difficult? Where would you do that?
Yeah, no, it's not difficult, other than it needs to be done at a port of entry. So you can pick up in, say, Havana. When the new arrivals, assuming they're flying in, arrive, they pay I think it's $5 or $10. I think actually it's up to $10 now, each person who's boarding, and then anyone who's exiting the boat and flying out again from a port of entry, there's a $10 fee to leave the boat. There's no problem doing that. We do it quite often. So again, it has to be at one of the ports of entry. You can't disembark anyone in some little town in the middle of nowhere. Probably you wouldn't even get off the boat. They wouldn't let you. So.
Okay. So we have quite a few other questions. If you are a foreign flag, like non-US, and you're arriving in Cuba from the Bahamas, would you still need the Coast Guard's 3300 form?
No, that only applies to American boats and American people. Yeah.
Okay. That's a good question. Good answer.
Yeah. I'll just say, everybody except Americans have been cruising in Cuba for years and years and years, right? So it's just all of the formality is just for Americans.
Yep. That's unfortunate, but I think we're all grateful that we can at least get in there to see it some way or another. We do have a few people joining us from other countries, so this is a good mix, because we're getting kind of mixed questions. Greg wants to know, what are the best items to barter with?
Okay, some good items, because when you're actually cruising, the majority of people that you will meet will be fishermen. And you'll see their boats and you'll see the gear they're using, and no 10-year-old out off the harbor would be using such pathetic stuff. So any fishing line or hooks, a little anchor, often they're using like a frayed piece of rope tied around a rock, so anything like that. Also, what's very good, if you rummage around through your shed drawers and tins and any bits of spare hardware that you have, screws, nails, anything like that, washers, all of those come in handy. And those are easy little things you can take with you. Once you're going ashore, with the fishermen too, often ball caps are really good, and t-shirts. You'll see them in some really rugged, holey clothes. So they can use clothes and hats and sometimes even a bottle of water. Sometimes they're out there and they're pretty thirsty. When you're going ashore and you're in towns and villages, toiletries, any kind of toiletries, are all very good trading. Often just you give them away, really. Sometimes you'll see some, typically it's the older people in Cuba who are not very well looked after. They're the ones who are the poorest, hardest done by, and they really appreciate anything you can give them. And toiletries in Cuba, to buy them, are for the Cubans very expensive.
I know when we were in the Dominican Republic, we had to do a little bit of trading, and one of the most popular items was like snacks, like bags of potato chips and things that were more American.
Oh, no, that I wouldn't say that was the case in Cuba. They have lots of snacks, and if they've got a bit of money, they can get American type snacks.
Okay, good to know.
What we've noticed since the early days of going to Cuba, the Cubans were all really thin. There weren't many snacks. They were eating rice and beans and chicken. Well, they got bigger. They've got a lot bigger. They're drinking Coke and ice cream and it's French fries, and it's really noticeable in their physique.
That happens to the whole world as the American diet spreads, right? We have a few more questions here. What about another question about the Form 3300? If you have a foreign flag, but you have U.S. passengers or U.S. owners, though it is foreign flagged, would you need the Coast Guard 3300 form?
I would say not. I can't say for sure, but I would say probably not needed.
Yeah, that's kind of an outlying situation. Thanks, Fred, for asking that question. I'll look into it a little bit further. That is kind of the outlier. Interesting scenario. We have another question from John. He's the captain of a 100-foot yacht. They carry scooters, but they need to pay a refundable bond and/or permit to use the ground vehicles that you're bringing in.
Yeah. When you get to your port of entry, and you have motorbikes or scooters on board, you have to go in, basically in Havana, you've got to go right downtown and you've got to get a special license plate for that vehicle, which costs money. I can't tell you right now what that fee is. It wasn't super expensive, although it may have gone up a little. When you leave the port of entry and go cruising, you have to have that vehicle back on the boat, and you're not allowed to disembark it again anywhere else until you get to another port of entry.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. And Michael was wondering if you can scuba dive anywhere in Cuba, and is there anywhere to fill tanks? Is that something that you're familiar with?
They do a lot of scuba diving in Cuba. So you can pretty well dive anywhere. If you're on your own boat and you've got your gear with you, you'll find lots of great spots to dive. There are a few places that you could probably get a refill. One of the places I'm thinking is in the Jardín de la Reina, which are the keys on the south side of Cuba. There's a little floating diving hotel there. I haven't gone in there and asked if I can fill a tank, but I suspect they would do that for you. And a couple other diving places, Maria La Gorda is one, they would fill tanks. A lot of these places also have decompression chambers too. So it's possible, but it's not common everywhere. I know Marina Hemingway, they do scuba diving. So it's a matter of asking if you can and maybe getting friendly with the dive masters there.
Right.
So I should just point out too, with scuba diving gear, you need to bring all your extra stuff with you, your extra O-rings, everything, because you can't buy them there. You bring everything you think you'll need.
Yep, that's what they teach you in the basic diving class, that you should have a little kit with one of everything in it. But perhaps on this trip, you should take one with a few of everything in it. So we have another question from Bob about this, the same question as the scooters, taking the scooters ashore, but for bicycles.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Bikes are great in Cuba, and no, you don't need to register them at all. When you arrive and you're doing your check-in process, the Guardia Frontera, they'll ask you if you have bicycles and how many, they'll ask how many dinghies you have and the outboards and the make. So when you arrive, you're giving them all the information of all the things that you have on the boat. And then once you're checked in, you can take your bicycles wherever you want to go.
Okay.
What we usually do is before we leave Florida, we go around to all the yard sales and we buy bikes that hopefully fit us for like $10. And those are the bikes that we take with us to Cuba. And then, you always make friends, meet people, and then we either give them or sometimes even sell them.
Great.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. So let's go on to talking about provisioning. Where would we refuel and dock and maybe fill our jerry jugs, depending on if we want to fill the boat or fill the jerry jugs? Where would we provision? What can we expect and where do we go? Bottled water, can we use bottled water? Can we use tap water? And English or Spanish?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's start with the English or Spanish. Pretty well everybody in Cuba speaks a little bit of English. In fact, Cubans are very multilingual. You'll find them speaking French, Italian, Russian, all kinds of languages, but certainly English is the language of tourism. But the fishermen that you're going to meet out on the reefs, they generally don't speak English. So if you think you're going to be doing a lot of cruising, meeting a lot of fishermen, it would be good to know a little more Spanish, but you can get by without it. As far as fueling, if you want to fuel with a pump dockside, that will only be again at the marinas, ports of entry. For the most part, they have fuel, but a lot of fuel, the situation that may crop up in the near future, Cuba was getting all of its fuel from Venezuela. And there's a lot of problems in Venezuela right now. And where they may stop shipping Venezuelan crude to Cuba. A friend of mine lives in Matanzas, which is a port where a lot of the fuel ships come in from Venezuela. And she says she wakes up every morning and looks out the window, and if she sees the tanker in there, she goes, "Oh, phew, we've got fuel for a little longer." So that could become an issue. I haven't known up to now anybody go to a fuel dock and there wasn't any. You can also get it quietly on the black market. So that's, and when you're using jerry jugs, basically you're walking or getting a taxi to a nearby gas station. And there's lots of gas stations.
While you're talking about gas, have you heard any issues with the quality of the fuel?
No, we've bought fuel there, never had an issue. Sometimes if you're buying it on the black market, those guys are bringing it in jerry jugs, which can be a little dirty. So you'd certainly want to put that through a Baja type filter. But otherwise, no, the fuel is good. It's good fuel. It might have a little higher sulfur content, so the smoke's going to be a bit blacker when you're burning it, but that's really the only thing. Provisioning, we always suggest that you stock the boat as well as you can with everything that you think you're going to need, and then anything you get when you're there is a bonus. Now what you can and know that you will get are plenty of fresh seasonal produce, veg and fruit. And by seasonal, if you're going in the winter, that will be pretty well all your salad type stuff, cucumbers and peppers and lettuce. You can get the fruit that time of the year tends to be pineapples and papaya. The mangoes, which I love, they're a summer fruit, so that's the summer season. Eggs are, some things come and go. Sometimes you can never find lettuce, sometimes you can never find eggs, and then there'll be so much of it, you don't know what to do. So it's all seasonal, fresh produce. There are stores where you can get sugar. They're called bodegas, and they were strictly and still are ration stores. But you can go in there and you can get for pesos, very cheap, sugar, and sometimes that's where they'll have the eggs and cheap cigarettes and that kind of stuff. In the main centers, like in Havana, there's North American style or European style grocery stores that are generally pretty well stocked. You can find most things there. Most things that will be in there will be European, a lot of Spanish products. The prices are generally fairly high. They'll often have, you can get nice Gouda cheese, which is great compared to the Cuban cheese, which is a really tough, rubbery kind of feta cheese or frying cheese. So pretty well, you can get anything there. In the markets, you can find rice and beans and your garlics and onions and crackers. I love their crackers, actually. So all kinds of stuff. But I always recommend going there well stocked and well prepared. And certainly once you're out cruising in the outback, you're not going to have access to anything. So it's best to go well stocked.
Okay, great. Well, we have a lot more to go. So let's continue. The winds and the currents. What can we expect as far as winds and currents?
Well, your prevailing winds in the wintertime are generally north of east, northeast to north of east, and in the summertime they're lighter and south of east or southeast. So you're in the prevailing easterly trade winds, which, depending on which way you're going, if you're doing just one coast down and back up, you're going to have a downwind run and an upwind run. Currents, the main current is going to be the Gulf Stream. And since most people are crossing, or a good proportion of Americans will be crossing from Florida, that's going to be the main current of concern. But because these boats will be checking into either Veradero or Havana, what we always recommend is to leave the Florida Keys side around sunset and make the crossing, not compensating for current, because the Gulf Stream can be running 3-4 knots. Sometimes it's weaker, sometimes it's stronger. We don't compensate for the current. We set our course, get to the other side so that we're on the Cuban coast in daylight, and on that side there's a countercurrent. So then you can make up your westing over on the other side with a fair current, and it's easy to do it that way.
Huh, that's really interesting for the people that, I know there are a lot of people in Florida that are cruisers that have only gone to the Bahamas, so that's a really different than just doing a crossing to the Bahamas, because we face a northern current to the Gulf Stream doing our crossing, and there's no making it up except for perhaps being able to go south after you get out of the Gulf Stream right before you hit land. So very, very interesting. Thank you.
It is a different crossing. It's longer, so it's generally it's an overnighter, whereas I know that Bahama crossing you can do it easily in a quick day shot. But with the crossing of the Gulf Stream, you don't want any northers. I know sometimes going to Florida, some guides say, "Oh, we'll go on a westerly," because you think, well, that's favorable in the Gulf Stream, but a westerly wind is the forerunner of a cold front. So, and those westerlies can come through heavy. Once that wind goes around northerly, if you arrived on the Cuban coast in northerly winds, that's probably the worst situation you can be in once you've arrived there, because you really don't know how strong that northerly is going to be, and the reef edge is right on the shore. So the waves might not seem big, but as soon as they hit the shore, the reef, they pile up. So it often, like the entrances into some of the marinas, they're raging and you can't get in. They actually close them. So that would be really bad, to arrive there in bad weather and not be able to get in. You really need to pick your weather window to make a crossing.
Yeah. So I had a question really quickly to go back to the water. If we could drink the tap water in Cuba?
Right, sorry, I forgot. No. The Cubans generally don't drink the tap water even in their own homes. They boil it. The only place, Veradero, the marina water, the hotel water, that's all actually pretty good because they have a really good water treatment plant there because they get so many tourists. So that's kind of an exception. Everywhere else, Marina Hemingway, actually the water there isn't too bad. A lot of boaters will drink that. But for the most part, the water should be treated. I think most people today are sailing, cruising with water makers, which is great. But if not, you may just want to treat it with a little bit of chlorine or something like that. When you're traveling overland, you definitely want to buy bottled water, and you can buy it. They sell bottled water everywhere. It's not very expensive.
Okay, great. So we're going to talk a little bit more about exploring and experiencing Cuba, like where to eat. I know we had a lot of users here that there were two currencies. So how do the currencies work, or how can we use US dollars, and taking GPS devices ashore?
Okay. Yeah, the currency issue, that's a complicated one, and it is for the Cubans as well. Having two currencies is not easy. So first, no, you cannot use American dollars. So you go to what they call a cadeca, it's like a bank, and you exchange your money. So that you're using the two currencies, you're exchanging it for what we call short coots or Cuban convertible pesos. So that's what they're going to give you at the cadeca. And that's, as a tourist, that's what you're expected to use a lot of. But you can convert some of those into Cuban national pesos. And that's where then you're kind of ducking into the local market. What's really good now is that everybody, the tourists and the locals, are using both currencies at their various rates. So one of the local money, pesos, is 24 to 1. One kook will buy you 24 Cuban pesos. So if you went to the market to buy your produce, your fruits, your veg, crackers, whatever's in the local market, you can come home with more than you can carry for the equivalent of $2 or $3. All of the signage is the dollar symbol. So you have to know at the local markets it's in pesos, but they will take a kook. It might say $5, meaning 5 pesos. If you give them a 5 kook, they'll probably take it, and they'll say, oh, they got no change. But pretty well everyone now is dealing in both currencies, and knowing the exchange rates on them, it can become very confusing. As a tourist, you'll use the local pesos at the market. Some taxis will take them. Even some of we call them bed and breakfast now, they'll take both as well. Some people, because they're planning to, or the word on the street is they are planning to revert back to one currency. But at this point in time, nobody knows what that currency is going to be. So everybody's hoarding cash of all descriptions, including US dollars or euros, just because the US and the euros, that currency is a hard currency. That'll always be good. Whereas the other ones, once they cancel one of those, the kook or the national is going to be worthless. So they're kind of hoarding money at the moment. But you can spend both, and it's easy to change them at a cadeca.
So the GPSs, can we take GPSs ashore?
No. GPSs, handheld GPSs and handheld VHFs, no, you can't take those ashore. When I flew down to Cuba to join that boat in March, I flew in with a handheld GPS because I wanted it when I was on the boat. And I knew that it was going to be a problem, which it was. But fortunately, the captain was there to meet us, and I was able to get a signal to him, tell them you asked me to bring it. And then it was okay because it was going onto the boat. So they know boats require that, whereas regular fly-in holiday tourists, they don't need it. So that it was going to be a real problem if I hadn't been on a boat. But anyway.
So along that same line, would there be an issue with having a sat phone on board?
Probably, sometimes what they will do when you're in the port of entry, particularly Havana, they will sometimes seal them up. Now, by sealing them up, all that is you give them a plastic bag, and sometimes they'll have their own tape, but sometimes you provide it, and they put it in the bag and wrap the bag up with the tape. So that's sealed. So what we've sometimes done, if that's happened, though it hasn't happened lately, we just unwrap it, make the phone call, and then wrap it back up again. So, but yeah, so anyway. But as far as taking those ashore, a sat phone, that might be a problem. But if you have your own little cell phone, iPad, all of those, they're fine ashore. A lot of the Cubans now have those as well. The only things that seem to be an issue to take ashore are GPSs and VHF radios. The sat phone may be okay, but it's on the edge.
So is there Wi-Fi available on shore?
More and more all the time. This year, there was a huge effort on the Cuban side to get Wi-Fi going in some of the marinas. So there was Wi-Fi. You can certainly get it at all the hotels. And to get on Wi-Fi, whether it's Wi-Fi at the marina or the hotel, you still have to buy a little card. I believe it's still $6 for it's down to $2. Okay. So anyway, so it's anywhere from $2 to $6, depending on where you are. You buy the scratch card, scratch off the pin, and then when you hook onto the Wi-Fi, you put that pin in, and then you're good to go. I know in a few remote places, sometimes you can pick up a signal. Certainly when you're traveling around Cuba, you know now where all the hotspots are, because there'll be a ton of Cubans all huddled around a big tree in a park or at the corner of a building, and Wi-Fi there. So more and more there's Wi-Fi, but people don't have it in their homes.
Okay, good to know. So John has an interesting question. He wants to go to Fiesta del Fuego in Santiago. Is he going to be able to find dockage at this fiesta in Santiago? What are the electric connections in Cuba? Is it 30, 50, or 100 amps that are available?
Yeah, they have 30 and 50 amps. They're very much on the North American system. I'm not sure what he means with Fiesta. I don't know. But there's certainly dockage there. So I suspect he would be able to get dockage. If not, what a lot of the marinas are doing now, like in the photo there, if there's not even, the marinas are all very small. So extra boats are anchoring out. In some locations, there's a small fee for anchoring out by the marina. And then you can bring your dinghy, and use the shower facilities and all of that. So.
Okay, good. So John says that Fiesta del Fuego is a huge festival in July. And John, I can tell you that any fiesta is way more fun when you're anchored, because you can make a zip line from your mast to the land and have a bunch of people come over after the festivities and do the zip line.
Really?
Yes. And Bernard was wondering, is electric frequency 60 or 50 hertz?
Same as us, 60.
Yeah, same as in North America, so it's 60.
Okay, good to know. And John, yes, I'm laughing too, because that's, if you only knew, that was, I have so many good stories. Okay, well, we are getting really close to being completely out of time. So if I have not gotten to your question, we will definitely answer you via email. And we do have just a bit more. We would like to let you know that we do have a Cuba package. Blue Water is offering a Cuba package available that you get the Navionics Nav Plus MSD Central, South America, and Caribbean that's preloaded, ready to use with nautical charts. So you do not have to go online and download all of your charts. You just have to put it into your chart plotter GPS unit. So they're preloaded. It comes with sonar chart and community edits, and you get updates every day for a year. You get that plus the cruising guide for Cuba. Thank you very much, Cheryl. And the Cuba flag, all of it. There you go. You can see it right there. Cheryl's showing it to you. You get all of that for $229, which is a significant discount if you bought them individually. So there's a link here that you can purchase that from Blue Water Books and Charts online. So thank you to Blue Water for putting that package together for us. And thank you so much to Navionics as well, and thank you, John, again. And thank you very much, Lee, for having your Cuba party tonight. So thank you to Navionics. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for joining us and for answering our questions. I think we are all looking forward to going to Cuba after you answering our questions.
You're very welcome. I didn't mention anywhere in there that right now they haven't made a change, but the Americans are limited, legally speaking, to 14 days in Cuba on their boat.
Okay, very good to know. So we will we'll have the slides on the Navionics Facebook page so that people can download those. We'll have at least a link to them. We will have the video of the recording on the Navionics webinars page, and that will also be shared on the Facebook page. You will also get a follow-up email with a link to these pages so that it's easily accessible. And also, when you get those links, you'll see the links to the Blue Water link so that you can buy that package that includes all of that stuff that you need for cruising Cuba. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me or answer the email that you get tomorrow after the webinar. And thank you again so much, Cheryl, for joining us and for answering all the questions.
Well, I was pleased to be a part of it. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll see you guys all soon at the next webinar. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Well, yeah.